Next, I'd like to bring up somebody else who needs absolutely no introduction, but I'm going to anyways because I found out a few things about our next speaker, Mr. Jim Rogers. Jim is the only person I know on the planet that's traveled to more countries than I have. So I'm actually a little bit jealous of that, but I'm trying to catch up as quickly as possible. I'm sure you probably all read at least one of his books. Jim's has written so many books. They're all excellent. My favorite is Adventure Capitalist. Jim does things, he'll tell you himself, one of the reasons he's been able to be successful is because he goes places that nobody else is interested in looking, which of course is one of the things that I try and do myself. Who's looking in Chile? Nobody, you know? I mean, there's really no, this isn't on anybody's radar. And as we'll talk later on in this weekend, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunities here. There's a tremendous amount of opportunities in Southeast Asia and Mongolia and these places that we talk about, and Jim goes to these places a lot. But the most interesting thing, actually, that I've found out about him is that his phone number used to be 5, which is actually the truth. He told us, I had actually the wonderful pleasure of having Ron and Jim over to my home for dinner the other night, along with a couple of friends, and he told the story, and I thought he was kidding, and it actually is true. Back when in Demopolis, Alabama, his phone number was 5, and maybe he can tell us that story later on today or this evening. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome the pride of Demopolis, Jim Rogers.
Thank you, Simon. I'm stunned. I'm delighted. I'm pleased. Could you all put the slides up, please? But I will tell you the story while the slides are coming up. I grew up in a place called Demopolis, Alabama, and my phone number was, in fact, 5. And, in fact, it was one of the last 10 towns, villages in America to lose just the operator. I went to college in the North, and when I was going to the college in the North, I had to call my parents the first weekend to tell them I was there. They didn't have enough money to go all the way to the North with me to drop me off at college. So in those days, if you called on Sunday, it was cheaper than calling during the week. And since we didn't have any money, I had to wait till Sunday. So I got the operator on the phone in New Haven, and I said, I want to call Demopolis, Alabama, and the phone number's 5. And there's this long pause, and she says, 5 what? You mean all 5s? I said, no, operator, just number 5, 1 5. And she said, well, are you a college boy? And I said, yeah, freshman in college. Very pleased with myself. And she said, I don't think this is funny, college boy. You know, I'm working. So I persuaded her finally that she had to call my parents because I had to tell them I was in the North and everything was okay. So in those days, New Haven operator had to call the New York operator, who called the Atlanta operator, who called the Birmingham operator, and finally we got the Demopolis operator on the phone. So the New Haven operator says to the lady in Demopolis, I have someone on the phone who says he wants to call Demopolis, Alabama, and the phone number's 5. And the Demopolis operator never missed a beat. She said, well, they're at church now. And so you could hear the New Haven operator sort of sliding under the table, and she recovered and said, listen, college boy, you should know better than to call your parents when they're at church. So yes, it is in fact true that my phone number was 5. That did not change. It was, as I said, it was one of the last 10 places in the world to change back in the 60s. But Simon also mentioned that I had traveled a bit not too long ago. My then fiancée, she's now my wife, Paige Parker, and I spent 3 years driving around the world. We drove 245,000 kilometers through 116 countries, as you can see, and we got into the Guinness Book of World Records because I'm the first hedge fund manager to drive around the world. So, you know, in my case, it was fairly easy to get into the Guinness Book of World Records. Since I'm here, since Simon has put me down to speak about the world, we're going to talk a little about the world. When Paige and I took off, we started in Iceland. We drove through Europe, Turkey, China, Korea, Japan, back across Siberia, into Mongolia, all across Russia, all around Europe, 32 countries in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, down to the bottom of South America, Central America, up to Alaska, back down to the southern part of the US, and back to New York. I was 3 years on the road. It was 245,000 kilometers. It was 116 countries. So you can imagine that we were tired when we got home. You know, been a long ride. So we decided we would rest for a while. Well, one of the results of resting for a while is we now have a baby girl. But I want you to know that I never had a child before. I thought children were a terrible waste of time. I couldn't believe that anybody would be so foolish as to have children, wasting their time, their money, their emotions, their energy. I mean, I used to feel sorry for people. When I first met Ron Paul, he had 5 children. I said, oh my God, you know. My parents had 5 children. That's why I said, oh my God, what a terrible, terrible waste of time. Well, I want you to know I was totally wrong. I was 100% wrong. I was absolutely wrong about children. You know, in fact, if there's anybody in the room who hasn't done it, I urge you to get home and get on with it, you know. You take a day off if you have to. No, do not take a day off these days. These are very perilous times, as Ron has explained, and as we'll talk more about this weekend. But, you know, go home for lunch. Take a lunch hour. I mean, do something. Now, everything that I tell you all this week, if I'm giving you advice, it's not just free advice. It's things I'm doing with my own life, my own money, my own time, my own everything. So when I say go home and have children, we did it. We went home for lunch. We got another one now. Now, I haven't caught up with Ron and Carol, or my parents, but I'm telling you, it's a whole lot of fun. What I want to do next, I'm going to show you a 2-minute video. I'm going to show you clips from going around the world. I cannot show. I've been around the world twice, once on a motorcycle and once in a car. I spent 5 years going around the world. So I cannot show you 5 years of driving around the world in 2 minutes, but a survey was done recently that the #1 dream that people have in the world, now obviously not everybody's #1 dream, but the dream which comes out on top in the surveys worldwide is to chuck it all, get in the car, and take off around the world. So I hope that all of you are going to make so much money with Simon that you too are going to get a new spouse, or take the old spouse, or take a spouse, and head off around the world. It will start with us in Iceland, toasting each other, wondering if we're going to make it alive.
To the best journey you've ever had.
Patience and calm. Off to the Great Wall. We went through 15 war zones. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you will see a familiar face. These guys were not very friendly at first. One of many markets we visited. One of many bad roads. This is one of the sadder times. We went to an AIDS orphanage down in South Africa. We went to see King Tut. Whenever we could, we stopped at schools because I'm very keen on education. Everybody always wanted to have their pictures made. Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, one of many roadside stands where we stopped and ate and drank. This is Iguazu Falls down in South America, not too far from here, in fact. This is the bane of my existence. This is bureaucracy, red tape, regulations. This, on the other hand, is the black market. This is a much higher class of people. And when we got back to the US, we kept going. We headed up to Alaska in the dead of winter. And when we got back to New York, our first stop was the World Trade Center. That had blown up while we were gone. So Simon has asked me to talk about the world. So what I'm going to do is take us around the world, and then later tonight, I and the other speakers will take questions during dinner. But the first thing we need to understand about what's going on in the world is the rise of China. Now, everybody seems to know something's going on in China these days, but most people do not understand the full depth and breadth of what's happening in China, including most Chinese don't quite understand the historical significance. The 19th century was the century of the UK. The 20th century was the century of the US. The 21st century is going to be the century of China and Asia, whether we like it or not. Now, obviously, there are lots of people in the world who don't like that, but in the world in which I live, I cannot deal with what I want. I have to deal with facts and reality. I don't particularly like the fact that the United States is now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, but it's a fact, and the debts are getting worse. If you look at what's happening in the world, there's a major, in the 1920s and 30s, there was a major transition from the UK to the US. It was exacerbated by a financial crisis and mistakes made by politicians. Well, once again, there's a huge historic shift taking place, this time from the US to Asia, exacerbated by a financial crisis and mistakes made by politicians. Most people didn't understand the shift back 70 years ago until later. Most people don't understand the depth of the shift now. But it is taking place. I said the United States is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. You can look at that map and you can see lots of other big debtor nations that are getting worse, not better. There's not a single, in Europe they talk about austerity, but there's not a single European country which will have lower debt this year than last year, or lower debt next year than this year. The debts around the West anyway, and much of the world, are going higher and higher. The largest creditor nations in the world, the largest creditor nations are China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. The assets are in Asia, and the debts are in the West. Again, whether we like it or not. So in China, they certainly call themselves communists, but let me tell you, they are among the best capitalists in the world. I know people who would tell you that they are the best capitalists in the world as we speak here in 2013. Now, as China, and by the way, in China, while they call themselves communists, they save and invest over 35% of their income. In America, we save and invest 2 or 3% of our income. In China, when they come to work, they don't say, how many days holiday do I get? They say, how many days can I come to work? Because they want to live the way we do in the developed world. They've all seen Dallas on TV now. They know how it is in the West, in Texas, where Ron and Carol are from. So it's changing pretty dramatically. And that means all of Asia, just as Canada became very wealthy because they had a rich neighbor, many countries in Asia will become rich with the rise of China. Now, China is the only country I know of in world history that's had recurring periods of greatness. Great Britain was great once, Egypt was great once, Rome was great once, but China's been great 3 or 4 times in their history. They have also been catastrophic 3 or 4 times in their history. They periodically coze off, have civil wars, kill each other, and go into dramatic decline. In 1978, after 300 or 400 years of decline, Deng Xiaoping said, we've got to try something new. He opened entrepreneurship and capitalism again in China. You know the rest of the story. This is not a one-decade happen chance. It's been going on for 30 years now, but in my view, it's going to continue to change the world as we know it. That's where the assets are, and throughout history, you have not seen people say, look at all the debtors over there. Let's go and join those debtors. No, throughout history, people have said, look at all that money. Let's go over there where the money is. And the money, the energy, the drive, the ambition, the education is now in Asia. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, well, let me tell you that the best advice I can give you, you're going to get a lot of advice this weekend, but the best advice I can give you of any kind is to make sure your children and grandchildren speak Chinese, because it's going to be the most important language in their lifetime. Lest you think I'm just talking again, 6 years ago, we sold our house in New York. We moved to Asia because I think that the best skills that I can give two children born in 2003 and 2008 is to know Asia and to speak Mandarin. Both of my little girls speak perfect Mandarin. If you hear my children speak, you think they are Chinese. I mean, when you see them, they got blue eyes and blonde hair, so you know they're not Chinese. But they both speak perfect Mandarin. They go to school, public school in Singapore, where we moved. And many of you have heard about how rigorous Asian education is. I had too, and I said, that's what I want. And it is what I want, but boy, I'm telling you, it is really rigorous and demanding in the public schools in Singapore. Now, as you know, Asian kids always come out on top when they take the international test. I'm living it. My little girls have had, or my daughter in the 4th grade has had more homework in the first 3 years of school than I had in 12 years of school in Alabama and in America. They're teaching at much more advanced levels already. The rigor, the demands. I mean, next year I'm going to have to call some of you to help me with the math. I'm telling you, it's astonishing. And the Chinese, obviously, I cannot help her with at all, but they really have demanding schools. So what you hear about Asian education, what you hear about Asia, about all these how these places are rising, they're not rising because they're some kind of evil people. They're rising because they educate their kids dramatically and with the rigor, and they save and invest huge amounts of their money, and they work from dawn to dusk. I mean, it's simple. They're not evil people conniving. They just want to live like we do. They want to live like America was 100 years ago. They want to live like the UK was 200 years ago. And I don't blame them. We all want the same. So we have moved to Asia. Now, there are many other countries in Asia which will continue to do well. If you could put the map back up, please. You know, if you just look at that map, we live in Singapore, which has been a great success story. But nearly every country there, I can tell you good things about. Two of the places that I'm extremely optimistic, well, I'm not optimistic about India. I'm not the least bit optimistic about India going forward. If you can only visit one country in your life, I suggest you visit India. There is no country in the world, from a visitor's point of view, like India. I mean, it's got a combination of man-made and natural sites. The men and women are beautiful and handsome, very smart. The languages, the foods, the religions. I mean, you walk down the street or drive down the highway in India, it is a constant sensory feast. But as far as a place to do business, not with my money. In fact, I'm short India I'm so short India as we speak. India has the world's worst bureaucracy. I've been to many countries, and I'm telling you, the Indians are the worst of all of them. The Indians learned bureaucracy from the English, and then they took it to a higher plane, you know. They outsmarted the English quickly and made it even worse, with all due respect to Nigel, our English representative here today. So other than India and maybe Pakistan, I am very optimistic about what's going on in nearly all countries in Asia, some at different levels than others. I'm probably the most bullish on Myanmar, which used to be called Burma. Burma in 1962 was the richest country in Asia. They closed off. By the way, many countries in history have closed off and gone into steady decline. Well, in 62, Burma closed off and it went from being the richest country in Asia to the poorest country in Asia in 50 or 60 years. It's astonishing what governments can do to ruin a country. But last year, the new leader of Myanmar, said we've got to do something new, and he's opened up again, just like in 1978. Deng Xiaoping said the same thing in China. It's a wonderful opportunity. There's a fledgling stock market. I mainly invest in stock markets. I have a few investments in Myanmar. They're working on a stock market. I hope to invest more in Myanmar going forward. Another country where I see great opportunities in Asia is North Korea. Unfortunately, I'm an American, so there's not unfortunately I'm an American. I mean, from an investor's point of view, there's no way very few ways for Americans to invest in North Korea. The only way I know is to buy stamps or gold and silver coins from North Korea. I have done that. In fact, I bought more gold and silver coins from North Korea just yesterday, because my view is that North Korea is going to disappear. The two countries will merge before too much longer. And then the risk with gold and silver coins, of course, is gold and silver could collapse. But even if they do collapse, if North Korea collapses first, or when North Korea collapses, the value of those coins as collector's items will be much greater. So those are a couple of countries in Asia. I was given the mandate to take you around the world. As we look at the map, since we're going around the world, much of Africa I'm very optimistic about, especially sub-Saharan Africa, black Africa, if you want to use that term. The problem with Africa is there are more than 50 countries, so it's hard to make gross generalizations, but Africa is a country of great natural resources. You know, back in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s, as most of those countries gained their independence, socialism and communism were all the rage, and so most of them became socialist countries or were led by socialists. But after the Berlin Wall fell, and in the next few years, very few people wanted to be a socialist anymore, and if they did want to be socialists, they wanted to be rich socialists. You know, they could see, they could tell the difference, that communism had failed. And so there are now great opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, as far as I'm concerned. If there were 6 of me, one of me would be in Angola right now, one of me would be in Ethiopia right now. There are various wonderful opportunities in Africa. South America is another place where there are opportunities. I'm not as optimistic about South America as I am about Asia, but there's certainly great opportunities here. Part of the problem with South America is they constantly come up with these absurd governments. You see what's happening in Argentina at the moment. Brazil, you know, Brazil is full of natural resources, and I'm wildly bullish on natural resources. But the Brazilians say, this is not, I'm not saying this, the Brazilians say, Brazil is the next great country in the world. It always has been, and it always will be, you know. And then you ask them why, and they say, look, Brazil is God's chosen country. This is the one that is the best. He gave us everything. But then he sent the Brazilians to run Brazil. Now, this is what the Brazilians say. I'm not bad-mouthing the Brazilians. So, you know, the current leader of Brazil is I'm sure she's a wonderful woman, but she's already making many of the mistakes which Brazilian politicians historically don't make until bear markets come to agriculture. There are some great things happening in South America. Chile, Simon has mentioned Chile. I'm optimistic about Colombia. I'm optimistic about Peru. If you have the staying power, you could certainly go to Venezuela. If you can wait 10, 20 years till the madness passes in Venezuela. So there certainly are opportunities in Latin America for those who are nimble and can do their homework, especially if you speak Spanish or Portuguese. So, but my main emphasis is on Asia, because that's where I see the 21st century going, and that's why we have moved ourselves to Asia. We are all American citizens, but I have moved most of my assets out of the United States because I'm extremely worried about what's happening there. We are the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. Ron has already talked about how, you know, the America that existed when I was a kid anyway is not there anymore. If they wanted to right now, they could drop a drone on this building because we are outside of the United States. And so Mr. Obama says he can kill anybody he wants to, including Americans outside the United States. So be careful. I mean, be careful what you say this weekend. They may send a drone down here to get us. You know, there's no more habeas corpus. They can break into your house at any time if they want to, according to the Supreme Court. So many of the things which made America great no longer exist. I'm trying to get my assets out of the U.S. Most of them are out of the U.S. I fully expect exchange controls in the next few years. And for those of you who have lived with or experienced exchange controls, you know that they can be deadly to your prosperity and to your way of life. So I am an American, loved growing up in the backwoods of Alabama, etc. But I am trying to get my assets out of there, and I'm teaching my children about Asia. We have our investments in other parts of the world. Speaking of the U.S., which is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and unfortunately it's getting worse, and as you all know, the present head of the central bank does not understand economics. He does not understand finance. He does not understand currencies. All he understands is printing money. His whole intellectual career has been devoted to the study of printing money. And as you know, we've given him the printing presses. And he has said, I will run the printing presses as fast as I have to. The man knows nothing else. In fact, I think I saw Ron questioning him on TV once. And didn't you say, Dr. Bernanke, the value of the dollar is going down? Aren't you worried about the value of the dollar? And the man said, under oath, if the dollar goes down, it really doesn't affect Americans unless they happen to travel abroad. I mean, I said, wait a minute. Did he really say, does he really think that? I was looking to see if he was lying or if he was just a fool. Well, he was under oath, so we presume he wasn't lying, at least knowingly, he wasn't lying. So, I mean, that's the situation we're faced with. We have the head of the central bank in America printing as much money as he can. You know, the Japanese in November said, well, we're going to print unlimited amounts of money. Well, Dr. Bernanke said, well, wait a minute, we can do that too. So he upped it so that now in America, they're buying over $1 trillion, that's $1 trillion with a T, dollars of bonds every year. And then, of course, you have the English. So, well, wait a minute, guys, we can do this too. So this is one of the few times in recorded history where many of the major central banks and major governments in the world are printing a lot of money at the same time. The U.S. is the largest debtor nation in world history. It's getting worse. Having said that, I certainly expect that's going to lead to exchange controls and the ruination of many of us. I do own the U.S. dollar at the moment, despite my dire predictions for what's going to happen to the dollar and to the U.S. I own it at the moment because I will see so many more periods of currency turmoil around the world in the next 2 or 3 years that many people will flee to the U.S. dollar. Not that it's a safe haven, just because they don't know what else to do. It's their automatic reaction to go into the U.S. dollar. So I own the dollar at the moment. My daughters, whom I've showed you, my daughters are Americans. They have bank accounts. They do not have American bank accounts. They have Asian bank accounts and Swiss bank accounts because they know what's happening to the dollar, and they know that in their lifetime, the U.S. dollar is going to be problematical at best. Some of you probably read about how 80, 100 years ago, pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. That changed, and everybody moved to the U.S. dollar. The people who recognized that change made fortunes. The people who didn't understand what was happening lost fortunes. So we're in the process of another major historic change away from the U.S. dollar. As I say, I own it right now, but you've got to figure out ways to protect yourselves, your families, your companies, your clients, because this is going to be another major historic change. And not someday, it's happening now as we speak. So learn about currencies if you don't know about them already. As far as other specific investments, I own some stocks around the world. I own shares in Japan. I own shares in Russia. I have been I first went to Russia in 1966, which was 47 years ago. And I was bearish on Russia from the day I got there until last year. So for 46 years, I have been pessimistic and bearish on the Soviet Union and then on Russia. But I have now changed my view. You know, if I'm right, one way you make a lot of money is to find something very cheap where positive changes are taking place. Well, I have begun investing in Russia on the long side. I've invested in Russia before, but it was always on the short side. A Russian journalist talked to me last fall and said, gosh, have you ever invested in Russia before? I hear you've changed. I said, yeah, I used to be short the ruble. She fell off her chair. That was not what she expected. But for the first time, I am now long Russia. I'm long Japan. I don't own shares in many parts of the world because I'm worried about, right now we have wonderful action in the stock markets, most of the world, because of all this money printing. I mean, they're printing money as fast as they can, and You know, you give me $1 trillion and I'll show you a good time too. And a lot of people are having a good time at the moment. I'm skeptical because I know that this sort of action nearly always ends very badly, because eventually people say, wait a minute, this is not working, or this is not right, or you have inflation, higher interest rates, more currency turmoil is coming, because it is artificial. It's extremely artificial what's happening right now. So I am worried and leery of most stock markets in the world. But I have, in the last several months, bought Russian shares and Japanese shares. I don't think there are any others that I can think of. I was recently in Ukraine, which is, you know, the second largest member of the Soviet Union. I am not optimistic about Ukraine, even though there's a lot of agriculture there. I own a lot of raw materials, commodities, because they're short. If the world economy gets better, there are going to be shortages developing. Maybe not this year, but certainly in the foreseeable future, because there's not been a lot of money spent on productive capacity of supply in the commodities world. If the world economy does not get better, which is, in my view, pretty likely in the next year or two, then they're going to print even more money. I know it's almost impossible to believe that they could print more money than they do now, but Mr. Bernanke will print money till we run out of trees, you see, if he has to, because that's all he knows. And unfortunately, that's all most central bankers know these days. They all went to the same schools, they always talk to each other, and they all say this is the right thing to do. So I own real assets as a way to protect myself. Historically, when there have been periods of currency debasement and money printing, the way you protect yourself is to own real assets or commodities, or call them what you will. I'm not sure that they will be so strong this year. The markets seem to think that there's going to be good crops, and so agricultural products may not be so strong this year. But overall, I'm extremely optimistic about agriculture. In fact, agriculture is one of the areas of the world economy at which I am most optimistic. You know, for the past 10 years, the world has consumed more than it has produced. We have consumed more than we have produced for a decade now. That means, of course, that inventories, worldwide inventories, are at very low levels, at historically low levels. So if we do have more weather problems or whatever, then we're going to have even more problems in agriculture. But it's worse than that in agriculture. Some of you have heard me say that we should all become farmers, we should all learn to drive tractors. Well, one of the reasons for that is that agriculture has been such a terrible business for 30 years that very few people have become farmers. I suspect most of you are reasonably well educated. I suspect that most of you had no classmates who became farmers, whereas in the decades before that, that would not have been the case. Right now in America, the average age of farmers is 58. In Japan, it's 66. In Canada, it's the oldest in recorded history. Australia, it's 58. The highest rate of suicide in the UK is in agriculture, because it's been such a terrible business. As you know, in India, a few million farmers have committed suicide over the last 10 or 15 years because it's been such a horrible business. At the same time that we have people getting out of agriculture because they're dying or retiring, nobody's going into agriculture. In America, more people study public relations than study agriculture. And as an aside, more people study physical education than study mining. Nobody wants to get a mining degree anymore. The Colorado School of Mines, which used to be the premier mining institution in America, got so bad that they give MBAs now. America produced 200,000 MBAs last year. America produced 10,000 agricultural graduates. So if any of you are looking for a new life, I might urge you to go to Myanmar or North Korea and become a farmer, as an example. There are plenty of places where you could go. Or South America, I mean, my goodness, plenty of opportunities. Africa, oh my gosh, in Africa you barely have to work as a farmer. You just sit beside the road long enough, something will grow in Africa. It's an astonishing place. So there are many places where you can leave here this weekend and head off to Africa and become farmers, or head into South America or Asia and become farmers. My little girls, the ones who speak Chinese, the ones who do not have American bank accounts, have never owned a stock or a bond. My little girls have always only owned commodities. And so far, my little girls beat the socks off the other little girls in the playground when they're sitting around talking about their portfolios. So I would urge you all to take lessons from my little girls. Simon asked me to talk about the world. Well, learn about Asia, learn about currencies, learn about real assets, because there's some very dramatic and historic major shifts taking place in the world. And if you want to survive and be the ones that become rich and successful in the next 20 or 30 years, I'm afraid it's not going to be in the United States. I'm afraid it's not going to be in Europe for the most part. I mean, they have really messed up a lot of things in Europe. I mean, Nigel's going to talk about Europe soon, but I would just say one thing about Europe. In 1992, they all drew up a contract. It was called the Maastricht Treaty. They said everybody is going to have a sound economy, and we're going to have a sound currency. Well, unfortunately, then they all started using phony bookkeeping. The people in Brussels who administer this sort of thing let them get away with the phony bookkeeping. You know, at one point around 1998, the French came up with some pretty astonishing phony bookkeeping. They announced it. I mean, it was so amazing that the Italians, who've been doing this for centuries, the Italians were shocked. You can imagine, you can imagine how bad it was that if the Italians were shocked. So then the Italians started doing it, but now even the Germans. You know, everybody uses phony bookkeeping, and they let in everybody else who uses phony bookkeeping. And at the same time, the people in Brussels, as all bureaucrats, became drunk with power, and they're now trying to tell everybody that they've got to wear white shirts and blue suits, whatever they're telling them. They're trying to tell them how to live, which is certainly not going to work as far as I'm concerned, but Nigel will tell us more. So as I look around the world, I see the opportunities, South America, Africa, Asia, especially in Asia. I can name you some other good countries where there are opportunities in South America or Africa, but for me, my family, our money, we have moved to Asia. And my little blue-eyed blonde girls speak perfect Mandarin. So I think on that happy note, since it is now 10:30 exactly, I'm going to stop, and thank you all. Thank you.